Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called the Secretary of State a glorified messenger boy in a congressional hearing room with 11 cameras already locked on the witness table, and she did it with the kind of casual contempt that only works when the speaker believes the room belongs to her before the first question is even asked. She leaned into the microphone, lowered her eyes toward Marco Rubio as if the distance between the dais and the witness chair were not architectural, but moral. And then she finished the insult with a precision that had clearly been rehearsed for the camera, not for the committee. You do not set policy. You do not make decisions. You sit on a couch while the president yells at world leaders, and then you fly somewhere to clean up the mess. So let us skip the prepared remarks and talk about the mess. The gallery laughed, not because the line was especially clever, but because the hearing had already been trained to reward aggression when it came wrapped in confidence. Her legislative director, standing in the hallway and watching on a tablet, typed 3 words into a group chat as if victory had already been secured before Rubio had even opened his mouth. She's cooking. That was the mood around Ocasio-Cortez's operation, the familiar mood of a staff that believed 5 minutes could be engineered like a viral ad, with every pause timed, every phrase sharpened, every accusation designed to land before the witness could bury it under procedure. She had prepared 11 questions, each one meant to hit in under 20 seconds, each one written to deny Rubio the oxygen that cabinet secretaries usually use to smother oversight with polite fog. She would ask all 11, he would answer none cleanly, and the clip would do what clips always did for her, turning a committee room into a campaign stage. For the first 4 questions, the plan worked almost exactly as designed, because Rubio did what everyone expected him to do. He answered like a man who had sat through too many hearings, served too many years in the Senate, and learned too well that the safest sentence in Washington is the one that sounds responsive without surrendering anything useful. The House Foreign Affairs Committee oversight hearing had already been running for 3 hours and 14 minutes, and Rubio had been sitting alone at the witness table through all of it. 1 chair, 1 microphone, 1 nameplate that read Secretary of State, and 1 water glass he had refilled twice without giving the cameras anything dramatic. Across from him, 23 members of Congress sat arranged above him in a raised semicircle of mahogany, brass nameplates, small flags, stacked binders, and microphones, all of it designed to make power visible before a word was spoken. They sat above, he sat below, they controlled the clock, he did not, and every camera angle in the room quietly repeated that fact. 14 members had already used their 5 minutes before Ocasio-Cortez ever got her turn, and each had attempted, in his or her own way, to pull a usable admission out of the man at the witness table. Rubio had not given them one. He had responded with diplomatic precision, careful hedges, soft qualifiers, and sentences that traveled an impressive distance without arriving anywhere that could be clipped into a confession. I appreciate the question, Congressman. That is a matter we are actively reviewing. I would be happy to have my team follow up with your office. These phrases were not answers so much as lubricant, the smooth Washington language designed to make 5 minutes slide past without heat, without friction, and without consequence. Rubio applied that language with mechanical ease, and no one in the room mistook it for confusion. This was not a man caught off guard by oversight. This was a man who understood oversight hearings from both sides of the table, who understood that Congress often asked questions less to learn the truth than to manufacture proof that it had asked. The point was not information. The point was the clip, the headline, the fundraiser email, the 18-second social media cut that would travel faster than the transcript ever could. Ocasio-Cortez knew that better than anyone on the dais, and that was why she had waited 3 hours without wasting her ammunition. She was the 15th questioner, last on the list, and she had been watching the room with the patience of someone who did not see the delay as a burden, but as staging. She had seen 14 colleagues ask, press, posture, interrupt, and then run out of time while Rubio survived them with the same smooth diplomatic pace. She had watched him outlast them all, not by dominating them, not by embarrassing them, not by fighting them, but by waiting them out. She did not intend to become the 15th person he survived. When the chair finally recognized her, she did not thank the secretary for appearing, did not acknowledge the length of the hearing, did not perform the usual little ritual of institutional courtesy, because courtesy would only soften the frame she had spent 3 hours preparing. She leaned forward, found the C-SPAN camera, and spoke past Rubio to the audience beyond the room, the way she always did when she understood that the people present were only props for the people watching. Mr. Secretary, how many USAID programs were terminated in the first 6 months of this administration? Rubio shifted in his chair, not dramatically, not nervously, simply making the small physical adjustment of a man preparing to deliver another answer that would sound complete while giving away nothing. Congresswoman, the restructuring of USAID was part of a broader effort to ensure that American taxpayer dollars are directed toward programs that demonstrably advance American interests and measurable outcomes. 47, she cut in. The answer is 47 programs, including 3 maternal health initiatives in Central America that your own department rated as highly effective. She did not merely interrupt him, she erased the first layer of his answer and replaced it with the number she wanted the audience to remember. Is that efficiency, Mr. Secretary, or is that cruelty with a spreadsheet? She did not wait for the answer because the question had not been built to receive one. She glanced at the clock on the dais, 4 minutes and 31 seconds remaining, and moved immediately to the second blade before the first one had stopped moving. You personally advocated for the capture of President Maduro in Venezuela. You called it a victory for freedom. So how many Venezuelan citizens have received humanitarian aid since the operation began? Rubio opened his mouth, and for a moment it looked as though the hearing would continue according to the normal script. The situation in Venezuela is complex, and the humanitarian circumstances there require a comprehensive regional approach. Reclaiming my time, she said, with the automatic sharpness of someone pulling a lever she had pulled 1,000 times before. The answer is fewer than before the operation. Your department's own quarterly report says so. Page 14, paragraph 3, and I have it right here. She held up the page, not to read from it, not because the room needed the text, but because the camera needed the image of proof in her hand, and Rubio empty-handed below her. Then came the third question, and she changed tone, softer now, which was always more dangerous than the cutting register, because Ocasio-Cortez, at her most personal, was Ocasio-Cortez at her most tactical. Mr. Secretary, your department expanded sanctions on Cuba in May, and Cuban hospitals are reporting critical medicine shortages. Your parents came from Cuba, your mother was a housekeeper, your father was a bartender, and they came to this country for a better life. She paused there, and the pause did exactly what it was meant to do, placing the personal story between the policy and the accusation like a blade slid carefully between ribs. Do Cuban children deserve medicine, Mr. Secretary, or do they deserve sanctions? In the gallery, someone exhaled loudly enough for the nearby press row to notice, and a reporter had already begun composing the headline before Rubio had finished adjusting his hands on the table. His palms were flat against the wood, fingers spread, the posture of a man holding something down, or perhaps holding himself in place. His answer came measured, careful, almost painfully disciplined. No child anywhere in the world deserves to suffer, and our sanctions are specifically designed to target the regime, not the poor. Reclaiming my time, she said again, because the answer, however careful, had lasted long enough to be useful only to him. Question 4 came fast, and it came wrapped in Munich, NATO, Europe, and the kind of foreign policy contrast that made good television because it sounded broader than the clock allowed it to be. At the Munich Security Conference, you told European allies, and I quote, "We Americans may sometimes come off as a little direct." Was that before or after this administration threatened to withdraw from NATO? Was that before or after the president called the European Union, your allies, the ones you were supposedly reassuring, worse than China? Rubio began to respond, and Ocasio-Cortez glanced at the clock again, 2 minutes and 44 seconds remaining, then smiled, not at Rubio, but at the camera that had been waiting for exactly that smile. It was the smile of a woman who knew the rhythm, knew the edit, knew the machine, and believed with the certainty of long practice that she was winning. She was winning for exactly 11 more seconds, which in a hearing room is enough time for an entire political illusion to stand upright, smile at the camera, and then collapse before anyone realizes the floor has moved. Question 5 arrived with the same confidence as the first 4, but it carried a different purpose, because this was not merely about USAID, Venezuela, Cuba, or Munich. This was the ideological question, the one meant to force Rubio into sounding old, frightened, doctrinaire, and allergic to the word equality. Mr. Secretary, you have repeatedly called democratic socialism a threat to the American way of life, despite the fact that millions of Americans support it, and despite the fact that Scandinavian models have delivered health care, worker protections, and stronger social safety nets. I want to give you an opportunity to walk that back, so do you stand by that statement? She sat back slightly after asking it, folding her arms with the body language of someone who had reached the trapdoor she came to open. Rubio was supposed to answer the way Republican witnesses usually answered that question, with a warning about taxes, deficits, failed states, and government control, all of it useful enough for her to interrupt and frame as fear-mongering. He was supposed to sound abstract, because abstraction was where she could beat him, pulling him into a debate about terminology while the camera rewarded her fluency. But Marco Rubio did not give the diplomatic answer, and he did not give the ideological answer either. Something shifted, not in the room first, but in him, and because every camera was already trained on his face, the room felt the change before anyone named it. The careful posture he had carried for 3 hours loosened, and the polished congressional grammar that had helped him survive 14 questioners simply fell away. His hands, which had been flat on the table as if pressing down the witness roll itself, turned over, palms open, in the gesture of a man no longer trying to contain the answer. Congresswoman, I do not call it a threat because I read about it in a textbook. The sentence was not loud, but it had a weight the previous answers did not, because it came without padding, without the soft cotton of department language, without the phrases staffers use when they want a sentence to die peacefully in the transcript. It sounded less like testimony and more like a door opening. What came through that door was not a white paper, not a think tank citation, not the usual Washington Museum of Statistics arranged to look like conviction. What came through was Miami, the kitchen table, the old family vocabulary of exile, and the kind of memory that does not need a staff memo because it has been repeated at dinner until it becomes part of the blood. My father was a bartender, he said, and my mother was a housekeeper. She cleaned rooms in hotels she could never afford to sleep in, and he made drinks for people who could afford to order them without looking at the man making them. They left Cuba because a man who talked exactly the way you talk about equality, about the people, about fighting oligarchy, took everything their family had and told them it was for the greater good. The name Fidel Castro landed in the room without Rubio needing to dramatize it, because some names do not need volume to become accusations. He said Castro preached equality and then moved into the largest estate in Havana, and the line struck because it did not sound like a talking point polished by consultants. It sounded like something a grandfather would say on a porch with cigar smoke in the air, not as an anecdote, but as evidence submitted by a life that had already seen the ending of the story. Rubio paused then, not the theatrical pause of a man hunting applause, but the pause of someone reaching for a sentence that could not be rushed without cheapening it. So, when you ask me whether democratic socialism is a threat, I do not need a policy brief. I need a phone call to my mother. Ocasio-Cortez leaned into her microphone immediately because allowing that sentence to sit would be dangerous, and she knew it. Mr. Secretary, I asked a specific policy question about Scandinavian models, she began, trying to drag the exchange back into the terrain where definitions could be managed and emotion could be accused of dodging substance. Rubio cut in before she could reset the frame, and the interruption itself carried a new authority because it came from the man who had spent 3 hours refusing to interrupt anyone. And I am giving you a specific answer. You asked if I stand by my statement, and I stand by it because I have seen the ending, while you are selling Chapter 1 and my family lived through Chapter 10. The room recalibrated in a way that did not require noise. 23 members of Congress shifted in their chairs. 200 people in the gallery leaned forward by degrees too small to measure but too obvious to miss, and the cameras made tiny corrections that turned the witness table from a place of defense into a place of pressure. Ocasio-Cortez looked at the clock, and there it was. 1 minute and 51 seconds remaining, still enough time to recover if she could force him back into procedural obedience. Reclaiming my time, Mr. Secretary, I asked about policy, not personal anecdotes. The line had worked countless times before because it turned the witness into the one wasting time and her into the guardian of the question. But this time it sounded less like control and more like a request that the room forget what it had just heard. Congresswoman, you asked me why I believe democratic socialism is a threat, and my family is the answer to your question. He did not say it with rage, and that made it worse for her because rage can be dismissed, while composure has to be answered. Would you like me to stop answering your question? She tried to say she wanted him to answer the question she asked, which was about Scandinavian economic models and whether they represented a different category from authoritarian socialism. But by then, the words were already arriving late because the audience had heard the deeper point, and the deeper point was that she had chosen the terrain of personal history first when she mentioned his parents, only to object when his parents did not serve her argument. Rubio did not let her rebuild the frame. Since you mentioned oversight, he said, I would like to conduct some. Ocasio-Cortez moved quickly. Mr. Secretary, this hearing is about the State Department, but he answered before the procedural wall could go up. This hearing is about oversight and accountability. And if you can oversee my department, Congresswoman, I can certainly examine how the woman lecturing me about equality spends her campaign funds. The room changed at once, not gradually, not politely, but with the sudden violence of a courtroom when a witness stops surviving cross-examination and begins pointing at the lawyer. Rubio had not moved from the low chair, had not climbed the dais, had not touched the clock, had not stolen the gavel, and yet the geometry of the room had inverted in plain sight. He was still physically below her, still sitting under the raised semicircle of lawmakers, still framed by the nameplate she had mocked minutes earlier. But he was no longer acting like the witness, and she was no longer acting like the only person in the room with a file. Ocasio-Cortez looked toward the chair, and the chair looked toward the gavel, but the gavel stayed where it was because Rubio's response was still tethered to oversight, still connected to accountability, still delivered in a tone too measured to punish. Outside the room, her legislative director was standing now with the tablet held in both hands, watching the screen the way people watch a car accident they can see forming before impact. She typed into the group chat that he was going off script, then asked what he had, and no answer came back because no one on the team knew. For 3 hours, Rubio had sounded like a diplomat, which meant her staff had prepared to fight a diplomat. Now, he sounded like a son, and that was a different kind of opponent, because sons remember numbers no briefing book can erase. You co-sponsored a tour called Fighting Oligarchy with Senator Sanders in 2025, he said, not looking down at papers, not searching through a folder, not performing the awkward shuffle of a man trying to find the marked page. You stayed at the Vdara Hotel and Spa in Las Vegas, $3,500 a night. Campaign funds. He paused conversationally, almost gently, and that was where the cruelty of the arithmetic began. My mother cleaned rooms at a hotel like that in Las Vegas, not the Vdara, the Riviera, before they tore it down. She cleaned 14 rooms a day and made $7.25 an hour. At that rate, your one night at the Vdara cost 483 hours of my mother's labor. He did not raise his voice because the number raised it for him. The number did the work because numbers, when placed correctly, do not argue, do not sweat, do not raise their voice, and do not need a press secretary to explain what they mean. $3,500 was expensive in the abstract, but 483 hours of a hotel housekeeper's labor was not abstract at all, and that was why the room received it differently. It turned a campaign expense line into a mop bucket, a timesheet, a pair of aching wrists, a woman on a bus before sunrise, and suddenly the politics of equality looked less like a slogan and more like a bill someone else had been forced to pay. Rubio went on, still calm, still seated, still speaking in the even tone that made the accusation cut cleaner. Lowe's Ventana Canyon Hotel in Tucson, $3,100, 427 hours. Hotel Palacio Provincial in San Juan, multiple stays, $4,000 a night, 552 hours. Every one of those rooms, he said, was cleaned by a woman like my mother, and the line was devastating because it did not require the audience to like Rubio in order to understand the charge. A woman like my mother takes 2 buses to work at 4 in the morning, strips sheets, scrubs toilets, wipes counters, makes beds so tight you could bounce a quarter off them, and disappears before the guest ever has to know her name. Then the guest arrives, sleeps on the labor, campaigns against inequality from the podium, and invoices the movement for the privilege. That was the architecture of the contradiction Rubio was building, not with volume, but with accumulation. One expense after another, one hotel after another, one invisible worker after another. And the woman sleeping in that bed, on those sheets, in that room, was flying across the country on campaign money to tell working people they deserve better. He looked directly at Ocasio-Cortez when he finished the thought, and this time there was no mistaking whom the sentence was meant to hit. They do deserve better, Congresswoman. They deserve better than you. It landed in a room that had forgotten the normal rules of reaction, because applause would have sounded partisan, laughter would have sounded cruel, and silence was the only honest response to a line that had just converted moral branding into moral exposure. In the gallery, an older man in the 3rd row removed his glasses and placed them carefully into his shirt pocket, with the quiet deliberateness of someone deciding that seeing was no longer the important sense in the room. Ocasio-Cortez's right hand moved toward the stack of papers in front of her, 31 pages of prepared material on State Department operations, USAID restructuring, Venezuela policy, sanctions, Munich, and NATO, but there was nothing in those pages about hotel rooms, housekeepers, or the number 483. Rubio did not rush into the next blow because rushing would have made it look hungry, and hunger would have given her something to attack. But maybe I am wrong, he said. Maybe you genuinely believe in democratic socialism. Maybe the hotels and the private jets and the $35,000 gala tickets are just the cost of doing the people's work. The sarcasm was not wild, not sloppy, not the kind that turns a witness into a performer, but controlled enough to make the room follow the logic instead of the mood. Then he turned the knife from spending to strategy, which was where the accusation became less about hypocrisy and more about fraud. Except there is an email. He did not pull out a document, and that made the moment stranger because everyone expected paper after a sentence like that. Instead, He recited it from memory, and the act of reciting carried its own threat, because it meant he had read the words enough times to keep them, not as data, but as an offense. Your campaign strategist wrote to you in March 2023. Subject line, messaging framework Q2, and one line stood out. Do not define democratic socialism. Let people fill in their own meaning, because the moment we get specific, we lose the suburbs. Then he repeated the command. Do not define it, and that repetition did not feel rhetorical, it felt prosecutorial. That is not a political philosophy, Congresswoman. That is a marketing strategy. You are not selling a system, you are selling a brand. The people buying it, the people in the Bronx, the people cleaning hotel rooms, the people taking 2 buses to work, think they are buying a revolution, but they are buying a logo. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, but Rubio was already moving forward. Not physically, but narratively, pulling the entire room behind him with the ugly efficiency of a current. He had taken her favorite word, people, and dragged it out of the rally lights into the service entrance, where it suddenly had a uniform, a schedule, and unpaid invoices. Then he introduced Elena Vargas, and his voice lowered just enough to signal that he was no longer talking about theory. Elena is Cuban-American in Miami, he said. Her mother came over in 1980 during the Mariel boat lift, cleaned hotel rooms for 23 years, and Elena opened a nail salon on 8th Street with 4 chairs, a nail dryer, and a lease she co-signed with her cousin because the bank would not approve her loan. In 2019, Elena applied for a small business loan to add 4 more chairs and hire 1 more employee, and the bank turned her down after telling her the political climate around corporate investment was uncertain. Elena said she was not a corporation. She had 4 chairs and a nail dryer. Rubio let the simplicity of that answer sit there because it exposed the stupidity of treating every business owner like a villain in a suit. Elena did not lose her loan because of a law, he said. She lost it because people with microphones spent years making the word business sound like the word criminal. When you tell the country that corporations are the enemy, the banks do not hear Amazon first. They hear Elena's nail salon on 8th Street. The point was brutal because it accused Ocasio-Cortez not of passing a bad bill, but of poisoning the atmosphere that ordinary people had to breathe while trying to build something. Elena's mother cleaned hotel rooms for 23 years so her daughter could own 1 small shop, 4 chairs, a nail dryer, and a future that belonged to her. And a woman in Washington who had never cleaned a room in her life had helped make ownership sound suspicious. In the gallery, a woman near the aisle opened her phone, not to record, but to call someone who was not in the room, because some lines are not consumed like content, they are carried like news. Rubio continued, and now the attack shifted again, from ideology to audience management, from the public speech to the private room. But the Congresswoman is not anti-business, not really, not when the cameras are off. At a private fundraiser in Manhattan, $1,000 a plate, which is approximately 138 hours of my mother's labor, if anyone is still counting. The Congresswoman told donors that the rhetoric can sound aggressive, but they were not coming for the donors' money. They were coming for the system. He let that distinction hang in the air because it sounded clever in a donor room and rotten in a hearing room. We are not coming for your money, he repeated. And that is what you tell the people who write the checks. The people cleaning their apartments get a different speech. 2 speeches, Congresswoman, 1 for the people who pay and 1 for the people who vote. In Cuba, my grandfather had a word for that, and I will not translate it because this is a congressional hearing. But the word exists, and it fits. For 3 seconds, the room existed in suspension, with every person present aware that the next move would decide whether the exchange remained a performance or became a reckoning. Ocasio-Cortez chose reckoning because retreating in that moment would have looked like confession, and She had not built her career by retreating from cameras. She rose from her chair, the same power move she had used 100 times before, a physical adjustment that forced the camera upward and made the speaker larger. But this time, standing carried something it had rarely carried for her before, not dominance, but necessity. She was not standing because she owned the room. She was standing because sitting suddenly looked like surrender. "Mr. Secretary," she began, and her voice found the register that had made her famous, the mix of Bronx edge, congressional rhythm, and moral accusation that could make policy feel like a street fight and a street fight feel like justice. "I have listened to you lecture me about your mother, your family, and your grandfather's porch, and I respect your family's story. I do." She turned toward the gallery because that was where her real audience lived. Not in the witness chair, not with the chairman, not inside the rules, but you do not have a monopoly on the immigrant experience. My family came from Puerto Rico. My mother cleaned houses. My father died when I was 19. I worked as a bartender, the same job as your father, and I poured drinks for people who did not look at me. So do not sit in that chair, she said, and act like the only person in this room who understands sacrifice. The sentence was aimed less at Rubio than at the cameras, because cameras love moral symmetry, and she was trying to rebuild the frame from immigrant son versus socialist brand into immigrant story versus immigrant story. She was good at it, better than most people in that building, and even the people who disliked her understood that when she found her rhythm, the room had to deal with it. "The difference between you and me is not where we came from," she said, "because both of us came from families that worked with their hands. The difference is what we decided to do about it. You decided to serve the people who stay at the hotels," she said, "and I decided to fight for the people who clean them." Democrats on the dais erupted before the sentence had even finished settling into the microphones because it gave them the clean line they had been waiting for. Senator Blumenthal struck the table with his palm. 3 members applauded openly, and the press row came alive with the small, frantic movements of producers, reporters, and staffers who knew a clip had just been born. The gallery divided itself in real time, half applauding, half watching the applause, with the uneasy awareness that this was no longer a hearing so much as a struggle over who owned the language of working people. For one sharp moment, the room belonged to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez again. Marco Rubio waited, and that waiting was the cruelest answer he could have given her in that instant. He did not interrupt the applause, did not roll his eyes, did not perform outrage, and did not give her the gift of looking rattled. He let the room spend its noise, let the cameras collect her strongest 30 seconds, let the press row finish marking the time code, and let the Democratic side believe the turn had landed clean. Then he placed his hands flat on the table again, palms down, fingers spread, the same posture from the beginning, but now stripped of all defensiveness. At the start of the hearing, it had looked like a man holding himself in place, and now it looked like a man resting before he finished. "Congresswoman," he said, "you said you decided to fight for the people who clean the rooms." He paused, and the pause was short enough not to seem theatrical, but long enough to make everyone lean toward the next sentence. "Then why did you not pay them?" 8 words cut through the applause, the performance, the immigrant symmetry, the bartender comparison, the moral high ground, and the familiar machinery she had just restarted. The room did not gasp, because gasps belong to melodrama, and what happened instead was uglier, quieter, and more physical. It contracted the way a lung contracts before a cough, involuntary and almost embarrassing. Rubio continued without raising his voice, which made the accusation sound less like an attack and more like an item entered into the record. "The bipartisan House Ethics Committee, not Republicans, not the administration, concluded in July 2025 that you impermissibly accepted gifts at the Met Gala. Your vendors were not paid for months. A hairstylist's agency, 4 employees, a small business, sent your office 3 payment requests, and your office ignored them until the investigation began. He let the number 3 sit there because it was smaller than 483, but somehow meaner. 3 payment requests from a small business with 4 employees, he said, the same size as Elena's nail salon. You say you fight for working families, small businesses, people who clean the rooms, people who pour the drinks, and people who live one missed payment away from trouble. But you could not pay the woman who did your hair. You could not absorb the cost of your own compassion, so she had to absorb it for you. Ocasio-Cortez's mouth opened, and for the first time in the exchange, no sentence came out quickly enough to save the frame. The ethics finding was public. The timeline was documented. The vendor complaint existed, and any answer would force her to explain the one thing her brand could least afford to explain. Why had a woman who built a career on taxing the rich failed to pay a small business for work already done? Rubio looked down at his hands, then back up at her, and his voice softened just enough to make the next line worse. My father was a bartender. You were a bartender, and you are right that we have that in common. But my father would never have failed to pay someone for their work, he said. That was not how he was raised, and that was not the country his parents crossed the ocean to build. The line did not need to accuse her of hating workers because it had already done something more damaging. It accused her of loving workers as language while mistreating them as people. That accusation was harder to interrupt because it did not live in ideology, it lived in the invoice. Then Rubio turned back to Munich, almost quietly, as if moving from one exhibit to the next in a case the room had not realized he was building. Since you mentioned Munich, Congresswoman, you and I were both at the Munich Security Conference in February. You told the audience that Venezuela is below the equator. He paused, and this time the pause carried disbelief rather than anger. Venezuela is 11 degrees north of the equator, which you would know if you had read the country brief your staff prepared. He recited the email again from memory, and again the lack of paper made the blow feel worse, because memory suggested attention, and attention was exactly what he was accusing her of lacking. Your foreign policy staffer sent you a prep document before Munich, and it included the line, key point, Venezuela is in the northern hemisphere, north of the equator, flagged because it came up in prep. Your staff told you in writing. You did not read it. Then you stood before the world's foreign policy leaders and got the hemisphere wrong. I was at Munich too, Congresswoman, he said, and I know the difference between north and south. Not because a consultant briefed me 5 minutes before a panel, not because a staffer highlighted it in yellow, but because when your family flees a country, you learn which direction you ran. The attack was no longer merely about a mistake on geography. It was about the gap between performance and preparation, between sounding fluent and being serious, between dominating a microphone and understanding the world beyond the microphone. Ocasio-Cortez stood still now, and the same camera that had loved her earlier had become merciless in its patience. What came next was not shouted, and that was why it felt final. You have a gift, Congresswoman, Rubio said, and I mean that. You can fill a room, you can make a camera love you, and you can make democratic socialism sound like a promise instead of a warning. That is a real talent, and I do not diminish it. But gifts are not the same as knowledge, and performance is not the same as service. My mother never performed, he said. She served 14 rooms a day in a uniform with a mop at $7.25 an hour under someone else's name stitched onto someone else's standard of dignity. She never gave a speech about equality. She lived it by doing work that people praised in theory and ignored in person. And she knew where every country on earth was because she had come from one of them. A chime sounded on the dais, sharp, small, procedural, almost absurd after everything that had just happened. Ocasio-Cortez's 5 minutes had expired, though time had stopped feeling like something she controlled several minutes earlier. The chair looked at her and said the gentlewoman's time had expired. She looked at the chair, then at the clock, then at Rubio still sitting below her at the witness table, still alone, still physically lower in the room. But the distance between above and below had lost the meaning it carried when the exchange began. She could have requested additional time, and everyone in the room knew the rules allowed it, but additional time meant Rubio would continue speaking, and continuing meant discovering what else he had not yet used. That was the danger now, not what he had already said, but what remained in reserve. She lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her, the papers built for a different hearing against a different man. "I yield back," she said. 2 words from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were not supposed to sound like surrender, but those 2 did. From the woman who had built 6 years of hearings on squeezing every second from the clock, yielding back was not procedure, it was a white flag folded into parliamentary language. Rubio said nothing more, because there was nothing left for him to prove in that room. He looked down at the nameplate that read Secretary of State, the same nameplate she had mocked when she called him a glorified messenger boy. By the end, the man behind it had stopped being the messenger and had become the message. The chair tapped the gavel, and the hearing was adjourned. The clip split almost immediately into 2 separate stories, because politics always tries to cut reality into pieces it can safely distribute. The first clip, Ocasio-Cortez calling Rubio a glorified messenger boy and firing off her first rapid questions, ran 17 seconds and spread quickly through progressive accounts. They posted it with fire emojis, capital letters, and the familiar declaration that this was how oversight was done. For a few hours, that clip looked like the winner. Then the second clip swallowed it. Rubio saying his mother cleaned rooms at hotels like that, Rubio calculating 483 hours of labor, Rubio ending with "they deserve better than you," ran 41 seconds and traveled farther because it was not shared only by political accounts. It was shared by first-generation Americans, children of housekeepers, bartenders, janitors, drivers, kitchen workers, and families who had fled Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and every other place where slogans once arrived dressed as salvation. They heard something in Rubio's voice that the first clip did not contain: recognition. Univision led with the exchange, not as Republican versus Democrat, but as 2 competing Latino visions of America. Telemundo followed with a panel that included Cuban-American women who had worked as hotel housekeepers and heard Rubio's mother in their own hands. One of them said he spoke for us, and the line mattered because it did not sound like party messaging. Ocasio-Cortez's office released a statement calling Rubio's remarks performative and accusing him of weaponizing his family's story for political theater. Within 6 hours, the statement had become its own liability because telling a Cuban-American son that he had weaponized his family's suffering sounded, to the very communities she claimed to defend, like dismissing the suffering itself. 2 progressive organizations that had endorsed her declined to comment, and in Washington, silence from an ally can be louder than an insult from an enemy. Polling in New York's 14th district showed her approval among Hispanic voters had fallen 6 points, not everywhere, not vaguely, but specifically inside the community she had invoked when she said her family came from Puerto Rico. Rubio had not spoken to Republicans in that room. He had spoken to the people in the middle, the ones who clean, cook, drive, build, wire, repair, and carry the country while politicians argue over who owns their pain. They heard him because he did not speak about them as a demographic. He spoke about them as family. In Miami on 8th Street, Elena Vargas was doing a gel set for Mrs. Dominguez, a customer who came every Thursday and had been coming for 11 years. The small television in the corner of the salon was tuned to Univision with the volume low, the way it always was while work continued. Elena had not watched the hearing live because people who run small businesses do not have the luxury of stopping every time Washington decides to perform for itself. Mrs. Dominguez looked up at the screen, heard Rubio say his mother cleaned hotel rooms, and turned toward Elena. "Mija," she said, "that is your mama's story." Elena looked up from the hand she was holding, one working hand supporting another, brush in one hand, gel and acetone close by, the small tools of a trade built on steadiness and care. On the screen, Rubio was talking about 14 rooms a day. Elena looked back down and said, "My mama did 16. Then she returned to the jail because there was work to finish, a customer waiting, bills to pay, and no applause arriving from Washington to cover any of it. The television stayed low, the salon stayed open, and 8th Street remained bright, loud, alive, and stubborn in the sun." Marco Rubio left the hearing room through a side door, and an aide handed him his phone before the marble hallway had emptied behind him. There were 3 messages from the White House, 2 from the National Security Council, 1 from the scheduler about a call with the Japanese foreign minister, and media requests already stacking up from Fox, CNN, and Univision. The aide said the networks wanted him that night. Rubio kept walking, his shoes striking the marble with the clean, hard rhythm of someone returning to work. The sound followed him down the hallway like an echo from every hotel corridor his mother had ever crossed before sunrise. "Call my mom first," he said. The aide wrote it down and did not ask why, because some things do not need explanation. Some things are not strategy, not messaging, not follow-up, not media management, and not crisis response. Some things are simply what a man does after spending 5 minutes in a hearing room telling millions of people who his mother is. He calls her because she is still alive, she is still the reason, and after all the cameras, gavels, speeches, clips, statements, and noise, she is the only audience that ever really mattered.